Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And, wasn't really expecting to be doing this. Okay, I'm gonna be honest, this isn't a video I likely ever would have been planning to do at all if not for the announcement the other day that these guys were breaking up. Calling it quits after 28 years in the game. Man, so much for having come too far to give up who they are, or their work never being over. Freaking quitters. Well, jokes aside, I went back and forth whether or not I should even do this video in the first place. I started this script and deleted it entirely 4 times over the past couple of days. It may be true that this is like the one regular format on this channel in which I have not yet talked about Daft Punk, but I mean, they have very few picks to choose from for a worst to best ranking. I always figured a ranking of their albums wouldn't make for a particularly interesting video because their catalog was so small. Like, that's why I don't want to do this format for Boards of Canada, for instance. Like, you can just watch the reviews instead. Also, I'd been holding out for the possibility of one more album so that there'd be something more of substance there, but obviously that was never to be. And I didn't feel like a video like this would really be adding much to the discussion that hadn't been said already. For instance, Fantano just made a pretty good tier list video on his channel that goes over their history quite well, and even if I do not agree with every detail of his experience, you should still probably watch it if you haven't yet already. But yeah, also more than anything, I just kind of felt like doing this video would almost feel like an obligation for its own sake, just capitalizing on this moment in time for the sake of extra views when I didn't actually have anything to say. That's why, for instance, I didn't make any videos in response to Sophie's passing. But there were a few reasons why I decided to go through with this anyway. First of all, what the hell is wrong with me and so many other people doing that knee-jerk mental comparison between something like this and artists actually dying? Have we just been conditioned that much from so many artists dying over the past couple of years or what? Neither member of Daft Punk has literally passed away. And I know damn well as a diehard Orbital fan that band breakups, whether or not they feel like they'd be forever at the time, are not necessarily truly forever. I mean, it's true that Thomas and Guyman are not literal brothers, and that they actually went out of their way to make a statement announcing their retirement after so many years of silence probably means they did thoroughly think through this decision, and were absolutely sure they didn't want to continue forward with the band. An announcement like this from them carries a lot more weight than it probably would be if the Hartnells decided they were going to call it quits a 3rd time tomorrow. But still, you never truly know, do you? I mean, it's not like we know much of anything about what they're up to behind the scenes. Maybe by killing off all the hype for new material and allowing their mainstream attention to fade away, attention I have a feeling they weren't fully comfortable to begin with, what with the costumes and lack of public appearances and all that. That could eventually lead to a return to the underground that could be healthier for them in the long run. Maybe there'll be solo records, or they'll just later feel revitalized with enough time out of the spotlight, get back together in another decade or two, and finally put one more project out. I mean, that was roughly the time frame I expected their next album release would have anyway. Whatever, I'm rambling. Point is, they're not dead or gone forever. And perhaps more importantly, it's worth noting that Daft Punk were the first discography review I ever did on this channel. I have exhausted the topic of Daft Punk on this channel aside from this one format, and all the videos I've done on them are really freaking old and from the time before I could confidently deliver to camera or write decent scripts. So I did kind of want at least one video on them under my belt that I would be able to watch back and not internally cringe all the way through. Which, you know, no guarantee that's actually going to happen here, but hey, might as well try, right? I also haven't had Daft Punk in regular listening rotation in many years, besides maybe rewatching Interstellar every now and then. Might be kind of fun to catch myself back up on their catalog and see if my thoughts have evolved over all these years. Spoilers a little bit, but not that much. And this breakup announcement provided me with a nice opportunity to just capitalize on this format once again. So I guess here we go. So all the usual disclaimers, this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it. All of their projects are someone's favorite or someone's least favorite, and you can't expect there to be any kind of overall consensus on this kind of thing. At the end of the day, this is completely subjective as always. I don't think you're gonna run into a lot of surprises with this video if you've already been familiar with my thoughts on their work in the past. But if you've never come across any of my older Daft Punk videos before, obviously not all of my thoughts are ones shared by the majority of fans of this band. The other disclaimer is that this ranking's only including the projects I did review videos of back in the day, so it will include the Tron Legacy soundtrack, but it will not include the 2 live albums. I'll briefly talk about the live albums in certain relevant segments, but it didn't totally feel right to properly include them in a ranking like this. I didn't really feel like they counted, I guess. And apologies in advance for having to speed up these tracks while playing them. I'm still trying to get my Avalanche's Top 20 video out of copyright limbo right now and really don't need to deal with the extra trouble. But yeah, that's all the prelude I got. Let's just get into it. Daft Punk, Worst to Best. At number 5, I have Human After All. Look, something had to be put in this spot. It's probably the one most people will commonly put at the bottom, but at the same time, it's also one I'm sure I'd end up with a bazillion comments from people saying, oh, am I the only one who thinks this is actually their best album? I mean, it's not like we got a lot of choices to pick from. It's certainly not like this album is bad or anything. It's got like a whole bunch of their most iconic and catchiest tracks. Title track, The Prime Time of Your Life, Robot Rock, Technologic, Television Rules the Nation. I happen to have a major soft spot for Make Love as well. You get the idea. And there's not even that much in the way of clunkers either. I guess Emotion and Steam Machine can be pretty tedious and one-dimensional, but that's about it. If that's the worst an album like this can do, then that's probably a good sign. I don't even know if it's as far a step down from their usual fare in terms of production. Sure, it's super distorted and blown out, and a lot of these tracks are really basic in their construction. But, I mean, their best albums aren't that much more complex sounding than this one. And it is cool to have this album where they decided to strip their sound down to the bare essentials while still feeling like the kind of thing only they would have done. The reason this is at the bottom is because it's the only project of theirs that was pretty much entirely invalidated by the existence of another one. While this project is hardly skippable, anytime I do listen to it, it just makes me want to listen to their Alive 2007 album instead, because that concert took pretty much all the best moments from here, and even some of the not as great moments, mashed them up with lots of their other classic material from their first 2 albums, and just had way better production on top of that. A track like Robot Rock in its original context, you could easily point at and laugh at how freaking rudimentary it is, and how blatantly reliant it is on one sample of Breakwater's Release the Beast. In Alive 2007's context, though, with just that bit of extra energy from the live crowd, the acoustics of the venue they played at, how the hell could you not get blown away by something like that? By the way, if I were including Alive 2007 in this ranking, it might be in between maybe my number 1 and number 2 picks. It may have one notable clunker with a disappointing mashup of Face to Face and Short Circuit that doesn't remotely improve upon either original, but fact remains that it's one of the best live albums in electronic music history, and the way they worked so much of their most iconic material together in this big, seamless experience is absolutely unbelievable. It's probably the main reason so many of us would have just been okay if they just decided to do one more live tour instead of further studio work. But I digress. Human After All, it's still a solid album all around. I could easily see people making the case for this one to be marked as their personal favorite. But of the 5 picks I have to choose from in their catalog, it's the one I least often feel the urge to want to come back to, so I decided to put it at the bottom. And number 4, I have Homework. Okay, for those not familiar with my history with these guys, this is likely going to be a surprise because this project is widely considered to be such a towering house music classic. And for those more familiar with my previous thoughts on them, the surprise might be more that I didn't actually place it at the bottom. Back when I reviewed this project in 2015 as my 4th ever album review, I gave it a very lukewarm 6.7 out of 10, and went into detail on how I didn't think it remotely lived up to the hype that so many people held it up to have. And I'm gonna be totally honest, purely from a personal enjoyment level, my thoughts on the album haven't really fundamentally changed that much since that video. I might even give it the same rating today. which does technically mean this thing has grown on me, since 6.7 isn't nearly a negative as rating to me as it was back in the old days. Basically just means I'm very mixed to positive on it now. Like, I did eventually grow to enjoy the track Rollin' and Scratchin', and would no longer mark that as one of the lower points as I did back then, but I do still think the project does fall off pretty hard with the track Rock and Roll and Never Truly Recovers. Rock and Roll itself still being easily my least favorite track Daft Punk ever put out, and a total boring, tuneless, one-dimensional, thin, underdeveloped, and overlong chore. Okay, it's not like the worst thing I've ever heard or anything, but it's like background music filler to me at best. Rollin' and Scratchin' at least banged markedly harder to make up for its lack of a tune or development over time. And that whole last stretch of the album isn't nearly as fun for me to listen to as the stuff that came before. I guess Burnin' and Oh Yeah and Alive are fine, but I wouldn't consider any of those among my biggest favorites from them either. And all three of those are better in the live 2007's context again. Indo Silver Club is still kinda awkward and annoying to me, and Funk Ad still feels like a kinda half-assed obligatory closer as well. So I guess that leaves the question of why I decided to put this above Human after all. First of all, for all my personal issues with Homework, I have way more respect for this project and what it did for electronic music as a whole. This album basically invented that whole movement of abrasive French house that was later picked up by artists like Justice and Sebastian and Mr. Oizo, some of whom became pretty influential names in their own right. For 1997, this did in fact really stand out from the crowd. And additionally, unlike Human After All, this album was not made borderline redundant by the existence of the live albums. I still feel like I'm getting something here that I can't get anywhere else. Alive 1997 may be a thing, kind of mashing up some ideas from this album and blowing them all out over one giant balls-to-the-wall 45-minute jam session, and that album is definitely fun too, but I mean, I've probably listened to it maybe 2 or 3 times in the past and that's it. I do still consider Homework a more fun listening experience and one I'd be a lot more likely to come back to. And I guess that's kind of the thing as well. Homework has had more replay value for me than Human After All. It may have more parts that I don't like, but between my respect for its place in history and my continual attempts to finally get it this time, or at least return to some of the best moments that actually have clicked with me over the years, I do feel like Homework has gotten markedly more attention from me. And for what it's worth, all the stuff on the album before Rock and Roll is really freaking good and totally holds up. I can't hate too hard on an album that also happens to have classic tracks like Revolution 909, Da Funk, or Around the World, that has a track like High Fidelity, which I still love everything from to this day, and the way they managed to make so many incessantly catchy hooks purely out of shredding Billy Joel's Just the Way You Are into tiny pieces, or even deep cuts like Phoenix or Fresh or Teachers that feel like pretty iconic moments. Or even something like Daft and Direct, as simple as it is something that I can just randomly find popping into my head without warning, and I mouth along to for most of the day. Come on. This album may still be heavily flawed in my eyes, and a lot of the same criticisms I leveled at it back in 2015 are issues I still have with it to this day. But I also can't deny that it is kind of a classic whether I like it or not. It may not be a personal favorite of mine, and likely never will be, but I definitely get why it is such a gigantic personal favorite of so many other people. And number 3, I have the Tron Legacy soundtrack. Oh, come on, don't look at me like that. This soundtrack is freaking great, and it's one of my biggest go-to, gold standard examples of great soundtrack albums that can be enjoyed completely out of context from the movie they're attached to. Heck, it's probably the single strongest and most memorable aspect of the movie it's attached to. I literally just name-dropped this thing in my previous video when I was talking about the hype surrounding the Minecraft soundtrack. I do tend to be a sucker for projects that can effectively combine electronic music with the sounds of a live orchestra, or even when the combination is not that effective, I'll often have a fun time with it anyways. But this was definitely one of the more effective blends I've heard of these two worlds, and it was a pretty interesting turn for Daft Punk that could move their sound into more subtle territory than they usually explore, many of these compositions not being much more than, blubbering synth bass underscoring pads of strings that really effectively match the futuristic aesthetic of the movie and could convey it in my mind even without seeing the visuals for myself. But there was still plenty of variety throughout this project. A bit of influence from the soundtrack work of Tangerine Dream and the like in their synth work here, and a lot of tracks that maybe could have, like, really similar ingredients and even lots of similar melodies being used as recurring motifs, but still all having just enough distinctiveness in their particular execution where I could recognize the vast majority of these tracks from a distance and be able to name them individually. Be it more synth-heavy tracks like Derezed, Solar Sailor, The Son of Flynn, Armory, or the badass end titles, or the orchestral focus cuts like Adagio for Tron, or Outlands, or Nocturne, or Rectifier, or the moments where the two worlds collide in a pretty badass way on The Game Has Changed, or Recognizer, or Disc Wars. Even if a lot of these tracks might have been too short to end up on, say, that top 10 list I did back in 2016, they still all really stick out in my mind, and I marked many as honorable mentions, since I feel like they too often get overlooked, because a lot of people just say, oh, they're just film soundtrack cues or something like that. I know full well that placing this over Homework is gonna piss plenty of people off, and once again, I obviously do have more respect for that album than I do for this one, and know I'm really going against the grain. But fact remains is that I do probably come back to this soundtrack more often and get more consistent personal enjoyment out of it. If a classic album like Homework is gonna get shafted in my personal ranking by a measly film soundtrack, let it be known that Tron Legacy is one of my single most listened to soundtrack albums, period, and I will fully stand behind it. It really does not deserve to be written off that easily. Whoopsh. And number 2, I have Random Access Memories. Daft Punk obviously did not invent the idea of throwback albums, but it has sometimes felt like that was the case, since this was one of those sorts of throwbacks that, like, everyone remembers, and so many people have, like, repeatedly tried to recapture the magic of in some way since. It was a throwback that just so happened to launch Daft Punk to mainstream level success and turn them into household names, feel like this giant memorable moment in time that officially made disco seem cool again after decades of the entire genre being a punchline. And somehow, for some reason, this thing still feels like it came out just yesterday or something. It obviously didn't turn me into a disco fan. I already loved that kind of stuff years before this dropped, but that certainly helped this project stick out in my mind all the more. And honestly, this project still pretty much stands up as nearly entirely bulletproof across the board. Well, almost entirely. There are a few clunkers like The Game of Love and Beyond, which are pretty dull aside from the latter's intro. And I used to think Instant Crush was a clunker too, though that one actually managed to finally click with me a lot more in my most recent listen. Better late than never, I guess. But the vast majority of these tracks are great, be it the simple and catchy disco pop of tracks like Give Life Back to Music, Fragments of Time, Lose Yourself to Dance, or, of course, Get Lucky, which a lot of people have said is overplayed, but I don't actually care. That track's just as great to me now as it was when I first heard it. I've never gotten sick of it. But there's also plenty of tracks here that have lots of instrumental muscle and feel like giant epic emotional journeys that just so happen to be 70s flavored. See the obvious 9-minute tribute to the great Giorgio Moroder himself, or the odd synth workouts going over lush orchestral arrangements in Motherboard, or the skyrocketing propulsive finale that is Contact, and of course the wild 8-minute journey through old school synth experimentations and heartbreaking balladry of Touch, which might have stuck out a bit more in my mind now that they have chosen it to underscore their breakup announcement video. I don't believe for a second that Daft Punk intended all along for this album to be their swan song when they first put it out, as I've heard maybe some people try to make it out to be. But I do fully agree that this is a fitting and satisfying note for them to have gone out on all the same. And with the announcement that it was their swan song, the whole thing did in fact get a noticeable boost in retrospect, since it coincidentally happened to work so well as one. But of course, it's not my favorite work of theirs overall. That honor hasn't changed since I first found out who these guys were in the first place. And number 1, I have Discovery.
At last, the long wait is over. The weight is off my shoulders. I'm taking all control.
I mean, duh. It may be true that I didn't love this album immediately on first listen. That must have been back in middle school sometime. I can't even remember. I remember my first reaction to it was like, ooh, I don't like all this auto-tune. It just sounds like all the stuff on the radio these days. That sample on Crescent Dolls is the most annoying thing ever. But, I guess I do kind of like some of the stuff near the back half, like Face to Face and Something About Us. And then eventually I learned how to get the stick out of my butt regarding autotune and all that. These tracks growing on me so much was what got me to realize that kind of modern pop can still be great, and autotune is just a tool to be used for good or ill. Discovery may not be all that deep of an album. I have seen people call it overrated, and I do get it. I've also heard people try to make this thing out as like this big conceptual masterpiece, and I'm like, well, I don't know if conceptual is the right word I would use. I guess it did help prove to a 2000s audience that electronic music could still work in the form of full holistic album experiences, but I'm not sure how badly such a sentiment needed proving even at the time. Whatever the case, Discovery is still the album of theirs I've spent the most time with, and it's not even remotely close. And that's just because all the formulas that Daft Punk set into motion here I don't think were ever fully topped. They were basically already perfected here. Boatloads of people over the past 20 years have tried to make these kinds of stripped-back disco and funk sampling house records that try to capitalize on the same kind of appeal and aesthetic. Like, there was this whole internet-based subgenre and movement called future funk that popped up in the mid-early 2010s that basically saw loads of small-time DIY artists trying to do the same kind of stuff that Discovery did. And there was definitely some good stuff that came out of that scene, but nothing that came even close to Discovery's level. Lots of people can listen to Daft Punk's music, find out what actually went into making it, and think, oh, that's so simple, even I could do that. But, I mean, not just any random guy off the block can put together hooks as instantly iconic and memorable as those that go into One More Time, or Harder, Better, Faster, Stronger, or Digital Love, can get these repetitive loops and patterns to feel so easily replayable without ever growing stale, like on Superheroes, or Voyager, or Veritas Quo, or Too Long, can make all of these sounds have the perfect amount of sonic clarity and never feel cheesy or overbearing, keep things varied enough yet forming a present emotional arc that runs through every track. And there's no way someone has that kind of, even I could do that kind of reaction upon hearing a track like Face to Face, which forms like the absolute perfect, complex, chopped up disco groove and is just one of my favorite tracks of all time, period, I think. That's my real number one track from them, by the way. Discover is just such an inhumanly good album all on its own. And that's even before you get to see the whole anime film later made as a direct companion to it, which makes the listening experience even more monumental, as if that was the way it was supposed to be digested all along. Interstellar is one of my favorite movies ever, too, and man do I wish more bands did stuff kinda like that. I don't even really know what else to say. Discovery doesn't have even the slightest of weak links in my eyes. It's already held up as a classic throughout all of electronic music. I've gone off gushing over it several times over the years, and my opinion of it is no less astronomical nowadays as it was when I started this channel, so yeah, there you have it. Thank you, Daft Punk, for your services to electronic music, and for this life-defining classic. And there we have it, that's the ranking. But of course, this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today, see you next time.